Into the abyss. Dr. Adrian Sinclair's heart pounded in his chest as the cold, metallic door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed like a death knell through the dimly lit cell, a stark reminder of how alone he truly was. His captors, an advanced alien species known as the Zephyrians, had thrown him into this forsaken place with little explanation. Only cold accusations of war crimes. The truth, of course, was far different. He was a medic, a healer. His only crime had been saving lives, and somehow that made him a target in this cruel galaxy of endless war. The cell was stark, unforgiving. It was made of reinforced metal walls, so thick that not even the harshest blasts could break through them. The only features of the room were a small drain in the center of the floor and a flickering red emergency light overhead. The air was damp, carrying the scent of rust and the distant echo of water dripping from somewhere above. Sinclair's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. He wasn't sure how long he'd been locked away. Time in a place like this had a way of losing all meaning. The weight of the silence pressed against him, making the space feel even more suffocating. But he'd been through worse. He had survived battles, ambushes, and the unrelenting chaos of war. A prison cell wasn't going to break him. Outside the cell, he could hear the occasional sound of the Zephyrian guards talking in their low, guttural voices. From their conversations, he gathered little snippets, enough to know that they saw him as a mere pawn, a human to be studied and discarded. One of the guards snickered menacingly as they passed by. "Let's see how the human fares in this situation. Maybe it will be a lesson for his kind." Their laughter echoed through the reinforced walls. But Sinclair refused to let fear take root. He wasn't a soldier, nor was he a prisoner. He was a medic, and he was going to survive. His fingers tightened around the edges of his torn uniform as he mentally prepared himself for whatever was coming next. It didn't take long for him to learn what was coming next. A distant sound like chains scraping against the floor echoed through the halls. The noise grew louder, accompanied by heavy, rhythmic footfalls. Sinclair's heart skipped a beat as the sound drew nearer. He steadied his breath, forcing himself to remain calm. A growl rumbled from the other side of the cell door, deep and resonant. This was no ordinary prisoner. The door slid open with a hiss, and a massive form was shoved inside. Sinclair's eyes widened in shock as he took in the creature standing before him. A wolf, but not just any wolf. This one was massive, its fur a striking mix of silvery gray and midnight black. Its eyes glowed a menacing yellow, and its jaws were filled with teeth sharper than any weapon he'd ever seen. The creature's body was rippling with muscle, its every movement exuding power and danger. It let out a low growl, one that seemed to reverberate in the very bones of the room. The door clanged shut behind the beast, sealing them both in the small, confined space. Sinclair's mind raced. He had been in plenty of difficult situations before, but this was something entirely different, a deadly alien creature in a prison cell with him. And to make matters worse, it was clear that the wolf was far from a passive prisoner. It was injured, its movements slightly off, but there was no mistaking the threat it posed. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The wolf's glowing yellow eyes locked onto Sinclair's, its growls soft but constant, like a warning. But Dr. Sinclair was no stranger to danger. His instincts as a medic kicked in. He knew pain when he saw it, and this creature, for all its terrifying appearance, was clearly suffering. "You're hurt," he said quietly, his voice steady as he surveyed the animal's wounded leg. A deep gash marred the wolf's hind leg, and the edges were already turning an angry shade of red. It was infected. The wolf snarled, a guttural sound that vibrated the air, but it didn't attack. Instead, it just watched him, sizing him up, as if unsure whether to strike or wait. Sinclair could feel the tension in the air, but he refused to be intimidated. They were in this together, for better or worse. Taking a careful step forward, Sinclair raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I can help you," he said softly. "If we're going to survive this, we need to help each other." For a long moment, the wolf continued to growl, but Sinclair noticed something. The creature's gaze softened slightly, the growl more of a frustrated rumble than a threatening warning. It seemed to hesitate, watching Sinclair closely. He could sense the creature's confusion, maybe even a hint of curiosity. Sinclair moved slowly, not wanting to startle the beast. He tore a strip of cloth from his uniform and reached for his medkit, pulling out a small vial of antiseptic. "This will sting," he warned, as he gently began to clean the wound. The wolf growled again, but to his surprise, it didn't lash out. The minutes passed, and Sinclair worked quickly, his hand steady despite the mounting tension. He wrapped the wound carefully, securing it with a torn piece of cloth. "There," he said, finally stepping back to give the creature some space. "That should help." The wolf sniffed at the bandage and gave a low, almost reluctant growl, as if deciding whether it should trust him. Sinclair smiled faintly. "Not so bad, huh?" he said quietly. The wolf lay down on the floor with a heavy thud, its glowing eyes still fixed on Sinclair, but no longer filled with hostility. It was a small victory, but in a place like this, any victory mattered. As the minutes passed in silence, Sinclair leaned against the wall, exhaustion creeping in. Despite the bizarre circumstances, he found himself speaking softly, more to keep himself grounded than anything else. "They think we're monsters," he muttered, half to himself. "Me, for saving lives. You for being what you are." The wolf's ears twitched in response, but it didn't move. "But the real monsters," Sinclair continued, "are the ones who put us here. And I'm not giving up. Not on you. Not on anyone." An unlikely alliance. The stillness in the cell was thick and oppressive, each second dragging on longer than the last. Dr. Adrian Sinclair leaned back against the cold steel wall, his eyes drifting between the injured alien wolf and the flickering red emergency light overhead. It had been hours since the creature had been shoved into the cell, and while the tension had yet to fully dissolve, the wolf's behavior had shifted. The growling had stopped, replaced by a low, almost resigned rumbling sound. It was as though the creature had come to some silent understanding, an acknowledgement of the strange new dynamic between them. Sinclair wasn't naive. He knew better than to trust easily, especially in a situation like this. But his instincts, those trained over years of battlefield experience, told him that this creature, this alien wolf, was more than just an aggressive predator. There was something else beneath the surface. Pain, fear, perhaps even confusion. The same emotions he had once seen in human soldiers who found themselves stranded, out of place, in foreign lands. And now, in this cold, unforgiving prison, they were both out of place. He glanced at the wolf, noting how it still lay on the floor, its glowing yellow eyes never leaving him. The creature's breathing had slowed, its body relaxed but still alert, always ready to react. But for the first time since it had entered the cell, there was no immediate sign of aggression. "You're smarter than you look," Sinclair muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "Not that I'm complaining." The wolf's ears twitched in response, as if acknowledging the remark, though it did not move. Sinclair chuckled softly to himself, but it was a bitter sound, one filled with the weight of his situation. He was stuck here, in a cell with an alien beast. There was no plan, no backup, no escape route. But that was nothing new. As a medic in the heat of war, he had learned to adapt. And right now, that meant surviving, by any means necessary. It was then that the silence was broken once more. A noise echoed through the facility, faint but growing louder. A series of sharp clicks, followed by the unmistakable hiss of the cell doors opening again. The wolf's head snapped up, its eyes widening, alert once more. Sinclair's own muscles tensed as he braced for whatever was coming next. From the darkened corridor outside the cell came the heavy sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow. The guards were coming. Sinclair could hear their low murmurs, their reptilian voices discussing something he couldn't quite make out. His heart raced. They were coming for him. He had no idea what they planned, but it didn't take a genius to figure out that they weren't just going to leave him here indefinitely. The door slid open with a mechanical hiss, and Sinclair barely had time to react before a new presence filled the space. A tall, shadowy figure entered the room, its silhouette partially obscured by the dim light. The alien, another Zephyrian guard, had a commanding presence, but it wasn't the guard that held Sinclair's attention. It was the weapon the alien carried, a long, jagged spear, shimmering with a dark, energy-infused core. The guard's gaze flicked over to the wolf first, its yellow eyes glowing faintly. For a moment, there was only a still, tense silence. The guard seemed to hesitate, unsure whether the creature was still a threat or not, but his eyes quickly shifted to Sinclair, narrowing as he took in the medic's calm demeanor. "You've been here long enough, human," the guard hissed, his voice thick with disdain. "You will regret your decision to save that beast." Sinclair didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened, his jaw set, and met the guard's cold, reptilian stare. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "Neither of us is your enemy." The Zephyrian snorted, clearly amused by Sinclair's words. "You think this creature will save you? It's just as disposable as you are, human." With that, the guard moved toward the wolf, raising his weapon, aiming it toward the injured creature's head. Sinclair's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't let this happen. The wolf might not be his friend, but he wasn't about to stand by and let it die. Especially not now. "Wait," Sinclair shouted, stepping forward instinctively, his hands raised in an attempt to stop the guard. His voice was strong, a clear warning. "If you kill it, you'll never get the answers you're looking for. This creature, it's a weapon, yes, but it's also more. You don't understand what you're holding in your hands." The guard scoffed. "A human trying to lecture me about my people's weapons." He sneered, the gleam in his eyes showing contempt. "I'll do as I please." Sinclair's mind raced, every instinct telling him he had to act fast. If he didn't do something now, the wolf would be gone, and he would have no one left to rely on in this cold alien prison. In that moment, something shifted. A plan, no matter how tenuous, formed in his mind. He wasn't just a captive here. He was a medic, trained to think under pressure, to make quick decisions and act decisively. He stepped closer, his voice calm but commanding. "If you kill the wolf, you will be left with nothing. It's hurt, but I can help it. We can be useful to you, to your cause. I've saved more lives than I can count, and I can save this one too." The guard's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. "And why would I trust you?" Sinclair didn't hesitate. "Because I'm your only choice. Without me, you'll never get anything out of it. We both know that." For a moment, there was silence, an oppressive stillness that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Sinclair held his breath, praying the guard would see reason. The wolf, still lying on the floor, let out a low growl, almost like a plea. The guard paused, clearly unsure. He lowered the spear slightly, considering Sinclair's words. The wolf's survival might be a small victory in this long-lost war, but it was one Sinclair would gladly fight for. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the guard grunted, lowering the weapon fully. "Fine," he spat. "You'll have your chance, human, but don't mistake this for mercy. Fail, and you will both pay for it." With that, the guard turned and exited the cell, leaving Sinclair and the wolf in a quiet standoff. Sinclair let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The air in the cell had changed again, but now there was something different, an understanding. Not trust, not yet, but an unspoken alliance had formed, fragile and tentative, between the human and the beast. For the first time since his imprisonment, Sinclair felt the faint stirrings of hope. They weren't alone anymore. And together, they might just survive this. The spark of survival. The sound of the heavy door slamming shut echoed through the cold, sterile cell. Dr. Adrian Sinclair watched the alien guard disappear into the darkness, his heavy footsteps slowly fading away. The moment the door clicked into place, sealing them in once more, silence filled the space. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but one heavy with uncertainty. Sinclair stood still for a moment, his mind racing. The wolf, Fenris, he had taken to calling it in his mind, lay in front of him, still and silent. The tense atmosphere between them had shifted again, though not by much. They weren't allies yet, not in any traditional sense, but the simple fact that the guard had spared the creature's life meant something. There was a chance, a fragile, tenuous one, that he could keep Fenris alive long enough to figure something out. Sinclair took a deep breath and knelt beside the wolf, his hand still steady despite the pounding of his heart. He had no tools, no equipment aside from the limited medical supplies in his tattered kit, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He wasn't going to let anything stop him. The wolf's glowing yellow eyes flicked toward him, its pupils narrowing, but it didn't growl. It wasn't calm, but it wasn't hostile either. Fenris's wounded leg was still wrapped in makeshift bandages, though Sinclair knew it wasn't enough. Infection had already set in, and time was running out. "We don't have much time," Sinclair murmured to himself, though he knew the wolf wouldn't understand. It was just something to say, a way to ground himself in the situation. He'd spent his entire career saving lives, and now, trapped in this alien prison, he was doing it again, just in a way he never expected. As he unwrapped the bandage from Fenris's leg, the wolf growled softly, its muscles tensing, but it made no move to strike. Sinclair's brow furrowed as he studied the wound again. The infection had spread, and the wound looked worse than before. It was raw, inflamed, and the edges of the gash were ragged. If he didn't get something stronger, something more effective, the creature would never make it. But the only thing he had left were scraps of cloth, a little antiseptic, and a few bandages, not nearly enough to stop the spread of the infection. Sinclair cursed under his breath. He had to think, had to come up with something. And then, as if by instinct, his eyes fell on the small drain in the middle of the floor. There was a faint stream of water flowing through it. Nothing much, but it gave him an idea. He stood up quickly, brushing the dirt and grime from his hands, and went to the drain. There was no telling what sort of alien materials or bacteria might be lurking in the water, but it was their best chance. As he knelt, he scooped up a small amount of water in his hands, trying to purify it as best he could by rinsing it through his sleeves. The water wasn't sterile, but it was the best option he had. Sinclair returned to Fenris, kneeling beside the creature again. The wolf's eyes were alert, but it still didn't move. Sinclair didn't know if the animal trusted him yet, but he didn't have time to worry about that. He had to act fast. He carefully poured the water over the wound, using it to clean the edges of the gash as much as he could. Fenris let out a low growl in discomfort, but Sinclair didn't flinch. He was used to the sounds of pain by now, human and alien alike. It didn't stop him. He gently wiped the wound as best he could, trying to remove any debris or dirt that had settled in it. The wolf's growling stopped for a moment, replaced by a sharp intake of breath, but Sinclair could see that it was tolerating the treatment, however reluctantly. "Easy, big guy," Sinclair murmured, though he didn't expect the wolf to understand. He was just trying to calm himself, finding a rhythm in the chaos. The medic's hands were steady as he reached into his kit and pulled out the last few remnants of antiseptic he had left. With a deep breath, he poured the solution over the now clean wound. The wolf snarled, its body twitching in reaction to the stinging sensation. But again, it didn't strike. Sinclair tightened his jaw as he wrapped the bandages tightly, hoping that it would hold. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he could do. When he finished, Sinclair leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow, and took a long breath. The wolf lay on its side, its head resting on the floor, still watching him. For the first time, Sinclair noticed something else in the wolf's eyes, an almost reluctant recognition, a flicker of understanding. They weren't enemies. Not anymore. "You're welcome," Sinclair said softly, more to himself than to the wolf. He had no illusions about their situation. They weren't friends. They weren't even allies, really. But they were survivors, both of them. And that, Sinclair knew, was enough for now. The air in the cell seemed to change. It was still oppressive, heavy with the weight of their captivity, but there was something more now. The wolf, Fenris, had been injured, but it was still alive. It was still fighting. And so was Sinclair. The moments passed in quiet tension, the two of them trapped in that small, sterile room with no way out. But they had one thing the guards didn't have: the will to survive. And as long as they had that, there was still hope. The thought was a spark, a glimmer in the darkness, and for the first time since he had been thrown into this prison, Sinclair allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it out alive. Together. A broken trust. The flickering red light above cast eerie shadows across the steel walls as Dr. Adrian Sinclair stared at the injured wolf, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Fenris, the alien wolf, lay on the cold floor, still recovering from the makeshift treatment Sinclair had managed to give it. It had been hours since the medic tended to the wound, but the creature's steady breathing was a sign that it was, at the very least, not slipping away. Sinclair's hands were sore and raw from working with the limited supplies he had. His own exhaustion was beginning to catch up with him, but he couldn't afford to rest just yet. They weren't safe, not by a long shot. If anything, the guards were likely growing impatient. The Zephyrians were not known for their mercy, and Sinclair knew that they would be back. It was only a matter of time. The cell remained eerily quiet. The sound of Fenris's occasional growl was the only interruption to the silence. Sinclair ran his fingers through his unkempt hair, letting out a frustrated sigh. His thoughts turned to the outside world, his home planet, Earth. How long had it been since he'd last heard from them? It was impossible to know. His mind was filled with the faces of those he had once known, the soldiers he had saved, the civilians he had protected. His heart ached with the thought of them, but he couldn't allow himself to lose focus. He had a job to do. His gaze shifted toward the door. The guards had left hours ago, but their presence lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. Sinclair had come to realize that it wasn't just his life at stake now. Fenris had been injured by the same enemy that had captured him. They were both prisoners in this cold alien world, and if they were going to survive, they would need to rely on each other. But trust, true trust, was a different matter entirely. Fenris's eyes were fixed on Sinclair as if the creature could sense the medic's inner turmoil. The wolf's yellow eyes were full of a quiet intelligence, but there was no hint of understanding in them. Not yet. The wolf had been trained for one thing: to kill. Sinclair had no illusions about that fact. This creature was a weapon, one that had been bred and raised for battle. And yet it was wounded, and it was, in a twisted way, vulnerable. Sinclair took a deep breath and crouched beside the wolf, his fingers brushing the bandaged wound. Fenris tensed slightly but did not react aggressively. It had to be a sign, Sinclair thought. The creature was learning to tolerate his presence. At least that was something. "You're not just a weapon, are you?" Sinclair muttered under his breath. The wolf didn't respond, but Sinclair wasn't expecting it to. Instead, he watched as Fenris raised its head slightly, ears twitching at the sound of something in the distance. For the first time, Sinclair realized how much they were in this together. He had no way of knowing what the future held, but one thing was clear: if they didn't find a way to escape, neither of them would make it. The Zephyrians weren't known for their patience or mercy. They would come for them again, and next time, they wouldn't just threaten death, they would deliver it. The thought of escape was nearly impossible. There were no obvious weaknesses in the cell's structure, no visible way out. The guards had been careful, far too careful, to leave any openings. Sinclair's chances of breaking out were slim, but he refused to give up. The stakes were too high. And then, without warning, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Sinclair's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind scrambled for a plan. The guards were coming back, sooner than he expected. It was too soon. He glanced quickly at Fenris, whose ears were now fully alert, its body tense, as though sensing the danger that approached. The wolf's eyes locked onto Sinclair's, and for a brief moment, the medic thought he saw something in them, a spark of something human. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "Stay calm," Sinclair whispered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. He knew he had only a few moments to decide what to do. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and a guard stepped into the cell. This one was different, a higher-ranking officer, perhaps judging by the elaborate markings on his uniform. The guard's sharp, reptilian eyes scanned the room, narrowing as they landed on Sinclair. "You," the Zephyrian officer growled. "What have you done to it?" Sinclair straightened, pushing aside the remnants of his fear. He had to keep the upper hand, at least for now. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice cool. "It's injured, but it's alive." The officer hissed in irritation, his tail flicking behind him. "You're wasting your time," he spat. "The creature is beyond saving. Its usefulness is over." His eyes flicked to the wolf, his expression cold and calculating. "It will be disposed of soon enough." Sinclair felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had hoped the creature might be spared, but it seemed that hope was misplaced. The Zephyrians didn't care for life the way humans did. To them, Fenris was little more than a tool to be discarded when it no longer served its purpose. "You're wrong," Sinclair said firmly, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. "I'm not wasting my time. The wolf is more than you realize. If you kill it, you'll be making a mistake. This creature, this weapon, can still be useful." The officer snorted, clearly unconvinced. "Useful to whom?" "To you." He glanced at Fenris. "It's just a beast, a tool for war. Nothing more." Sinclair could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. If he didn't act now, the officer would decide Fenris's fate, and it would be death. "Wait," Sinclair said quickly, his mind racing. "You don't understand. If you dispose of it, you'll lose more than you know. The creature has intelligence. It can be trained. It can fight for you, not just as a mindless weapon, but as something more. Let me prove it." The officer seemed to pause, considering Sinclair's words. His eyes flicked toward the wolf, then back to the medic. But before he could respond, Fenris let out a low growl, a deep, threatening sound that seemed to reverberate through the cell. The officer stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. But Sinclair, sensing the moment of vulnerability, made his move. "I can prove it," he said, his voice low but certain. "Give me a chance." The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between Sinclair and the wolf. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was doubt in his eyes. Sinclair held his breath. And then, without another word, the officer turned and left the cell, sealing the door behind him. Sinclair let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced at Fenris, whose glowing yellow eyes were still fixed on him, unreadable as ever. But for a brief second, the tension between them seemed to lessen. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Now it was up to Sinclair to prove that trust, no matter how fragile, could be the key to their survival. Beneath the surface, the days blurred together in the dim light of the Zephyrian detention facility. Time was something that felt irrelevant in a place like this. Dr. Adrian Sinclair had lost track of how long he had been in this cold metal prison, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was survival. Survival for both him and the wounded creature that had been shoved into his cell. Fenris, the alien wolf, was his unlikely companion, and it had become clear that, for better or worse, They were now in this together. Sinclair had seen many things in his life. War had shown him humanity at its worst, and sometimes at its best. But the wolf, Fenris, was something new, something different. It wasn't just a mindless beast. There was an intelligence beneath its glowing yellow eyes, a depth that Sinclair hadn't expected. He had spent countless hours observing the creature, trying to understand it, to see past the instinctual aggression that defined it. Fenris's condition had improved since Sinclair's first treatment. The infection in its leg had slowed, though it wasn't completely healed. The bandages Sinclair had fashioned from scraps of his uniform were still holding, but the creature's movements were stiff, cautious, as if it wasn't quite sure whether it could fully trust the medic yet. Trust. That was the key, wasn't it? Sinclair had come to realize that it wasn't just the wolf that needed to trust him. It was also about him trusting the wolf. But trust was a fragile thing. It could be built, piece by piece, over time, or it could be shattered in an instant. And just when Sinclair thought he had a handle on the situation, the Zephyrians threw another curveball. It started with the distant sound of clanging metal, a rhythmic thud that echoed through the walls of the facility. Fenris's ears twitched, its body tensing at the sound. But Sinclair wasn't fooled. It was the same sound he had heard countless times before, the unmistakable sound of the guards approaching. The question wasn't whether they were coming for him again, it was when. And this time, Sinclair had a feeling it wasn't just for a routine check. His heart raced as he quickly scanned the cell for any sign of a plan. The walls were still as unyielding as before, the door locked with the same alien technology that had kept him captive from the start. There was no easy way out, no clever escape route that he could see. But there was one thing he had learned through years of surviving impossible odds. When you have nothing, you learn to use what you do have. Sinclair moved closer to Fenris, who was watching him intently. The wolf's yellow eyes glowed in the low light, unwavering. In that moment, Sinclair could feel the weight of their shared predicament. He wasn't just trying to save himself anymore. He was fighting for both of them. And if they were going to make it out of here, they needed to do it together. "Stay alert," Sinclair whispered, crouching down to the wolf's level. His voice was steady, but inside, his pulse was quickening. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Fenris gave a soft growl, its tail twitching, but it didn't pull away. Sinclair was learning to read the wolf's body language. There was still a lot they didn't understand about each other, but something had shifted in the past few days. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A silent understanding that they were, in some strange way, in the same fight. Fenris wasn't just the wild, untamable beast it had been when it first arrived. No, this creature had potential. It had intelligence, it had instincts, and Sinclair was beginning to see that it wasn't just a weapon. It was something far more complex. The door to the cell slid open suddenly, and two guards entered, their eyes narrowing as they sized up the situation. The air seemed to thicken with tension. The leader of the two guards was a tall Zephyrian, his blue-black scales gleaming in the dim light, his expression unreadable. "You're still alive, human," the lead guard sneered. "And it seems your pet is too." His eyes flicked briefly to Fenris, who was now standing, its muscles coiled beneath its fur. Sinclair didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, calculating the odds. He needed to keep the guards off balance, keep them guessing. Any misstep, any sign of weakness, and it would all be over. They would either kill him or take Fenris for whatever dark purpose the Zephyrians had for their deadly creatures. "Of course we're alive," Sinclair replied, his voice calm but carrying a note of defiance. "What's the point of keeping us alive if you're just going to waste us?" The guard's eyes flashed with irritation, but Sinclair could see the slight hesitation in his movements. The Zephyrians didn't like uncertainty, and right now, Sinclair was making them uncomfortable. "You think you've won something." The guard's voice was cold, but it carried the sharp edge of a threat. "You're nothing but a tool to us, and so is your pet. Once you've outlived your usefulness, we'll be rid of you." Fenris growled lowly, a deep guttural sound that made the guards hesitate. The wolf was not intimidated, not by the guards, not by anything. It was a predator, and despite its injury, it wasn't backing down. Sinclair took a small step forward, his eyes never leaving the guards. "You're wrong," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "The wolf is more than you think, and I'm more than just a medic. You've underestimated both of us." The lead guard scoffed, but Sinclair could see the slight twitch of uncertainty in his eyes. "We'll see about that," he growled, his fingers twitching toward the weapon at his side. Before the situation could escalate further, a loud, harsh alarm blared through the facility, cutting off any further conversation. The guards turned toward the sound in confusion, their expressions momentarily distracted. This was it. An opportunity. "Now," Sinclair muttered under his breath. In that brief moment of distraction, Sinclair made his move. He darted toward the wall, quickly grabbing a metal shard that had once been part of the cell's broken equipment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to create chaos, enough to give them a chance to escape. Fenris, reacting on instinct, lunged toward the guards, its powerful jaws snapping in warning. The two guards hesitated for just a second too long, and in that instant, Sinclair pushed forward, grabbing the lead guard's weapon and using the metal shard to pry it out of his grip. They weren't out of the woods yet, but it was a start. Sinclair could feel the tension crackle in the air, the pulse of adrenaline making his hands shake. The wolf growled once more, its stance now fully defensive. The two were a team, and for the first time since entering this prison, Sinclair allowed himself to believe that, together, they might just stand a chance. Breaking the chains, the sound of the alarm still echoed through the facility, a sharp and jarring noise that reverberated in Sinclair's ears, masking the tension in the room. But he couldn't afford to let the chaos distract him. The moment was fleeting, and every second counted. He had the weapon now, and that gave him a chance. Just a chance. But it was better than nothing. The guards were disoriented, and in this strange twist of fate, it was their moment of hesitation that had given Sinclair the opening he needed. But the clock was ticking. Fenris had already shifted into attack mode, its eyes locked onto the guards with a cold, unwavering focus. The alien wolf's powerful limbs were poised for action, and Sinclair could see the muscles ripple beneath its fur, its tail twitching in agitation. For all the unpredictability of this situation, he was starting to see a pattern. The wolf wasn't just reacting out of instinct. There was calculation in its movements, a level of restraint that made Sinclair realize the creature was learning. They were learning together. Sinclair took a deep breath, steadying himself. The lead guard was still recovering from the brief struggle, disoriented by the sudden appearance of the alarm and Fenris's threatening posture. The second guard, smaller, quicker, and perhaps more calculating, was already moving toward the cell door, likely to call for reinforcements. Sinclair's eyes flicked to the wall, where an access panel to the facility's control systems was barely visible. He could see the faint outline of wires behind the cracked panel. If he could reach that, there might be a way to cut off the alarms, shut down the force fields, and just maybe, open the path for their escape. "Fenris," Sinclair shouted, his voice commanding but urgent. "Stay with me." The wolf turned its head sharply, acknowledging the call. Its body tensed, but it didn't make a move toward the second guard just yet. Instead, it watched Sinclair, understanding that their immediate goal was to make it out alive, not to fight for pride. It was a rare moment of cooperation, an understanding that defied the odds. Sinclair bolted toward the wall, his heart pounding as he moved. The second guard had already reached the door, but he was still fumbling with the control panel. It seemed the guards were still rattled from the alarm, further proof that they weren't expecting any resistance. Sinclair had no intention of letting that surprise go to waste. He reached the access panel and ripped it open, his hands shaking as he worked quickly. He needed to act fast. The alarm's blaring tone was maddening. filling every corner of his mind with urgency, but his focus remained razor-sharp. His fingers moved swiftly, searching for the control for the door's lock mechanism. He could hear the guards behind him now, their footsteps pounding as they regrouped, but he couldn't look back. If he did, they'd have the advantage. The wires were tangled, but Sinclair's hands moved instinctively, pulling and cutting through them, trying to sever the connection to the main system. Sweat trickled down his face, but he fought the panic rising in his chest. The pressure was mounting. He needed just a few more seconds. Finally, with a sharp twist, the wires came free. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden mechanical hiss, the force field at the door began to flicker. The guards cursed loudly from behind him, realizing too late what was happening. "Fenris, now!" Sinclair barked, his voice a sharp command. The wolf didn't hesitate. With a primal growl, it lunged forward, its powerful legs propelling it toward the second guard. The guard barely had time to react before Fenris slammed into him with brutal force, knocking him to the ground. The wolf's jaws snapped, but there was no killing bite, just a warning. Fenris had learned restraint. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a partner in this fight for survival. Sinclair didn't wait to watch the outcome. He bolted toward the door, pulling it open just as the force field flickered off completely. The corridor outside was dimly lit, but he didn't hesitate. He glanced briefly at Fenris, who was standing over the second guard, its eyes glowing with an eerie, almost calculating intensity. "We need to move now," Sinclair shouted, his voice sharp and urgent. Fenris turned its head, eyes narrowing, as if calculating their next move. Then it bounded forward, keeping pace with Sinclair, its powerful limbs thudding against the metal floor. For the first time, they were moving as one, no longer a medic and a weapon, but two beings inextricably linked by the desperate need to survive. The corridors of the Zephyrian facility twisted and turned in disorienting patterns, and Sinclair couldn't help but wonder just how vast this prison was. His mind raced with strategies, possibilities, and plans, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was getting out, getting away from the guards, and finding a way to escape before reinforcements arrived. They moved quickly, but quietly. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick walls, but Sinclair could still feel the distant echoes of the alarm ringing in his skull. The map of the facility that he had memorized in his brief time there flashed through his mind. There was a small, forgotten access tunnel that led to the outside, a way out that the Zephyrians hadn't bothered to secure because they didn't believe anyone would ever need it. It was their weakness, and Sinclair was determined to exploit it. Just a little further, he muttered to himself, urging his legs to keep moving despite the exhaustion and the weight of the situation. Fenris moved beside him, its presence a constant reassurance. The wolf had become something more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the unexpected bond that had formed between them. They had fought together, learned together, and now they were running together. Finally, they reached the end of the hallway, where the door to the access tunnel lay hidden behind a steel panel. Sinclair's hands flew to the controls, and with a hiss, the panel slid open, revealing the dark, narrow corridor beyond. Without a word, Sinclair gestured for Fenris to go first, and the wolf didn't hesitate. It bounded into the darkness, its glowing eyes casting an eerie light as it moved ahead. Sinclair followed closely behind, his heart racing as he realized the enormity of what they had just done. They had broken free from their cell, broken the chains that had once bound them. And now they were out of the reach of the Zephyrian guards. But their escape was far from over. The real fight had just begun. And in the silence of the tunnel, as they disappeared into the shadows, one thing became clear: they weren't done yet. Not by a long shot.